Get started out of respect for your time. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Erin Owens. I'm a professor in the Newton Gresham Library here at Sam Houston State, and I'm really excited to be speaking to you today as part of AI Week. We're going to be talking about the use of generative AI in research with different considerations regarding reliability, ethics, and disclosure. I will give you a link to the slides at the end of the session, so you will be able to refer back to all of this information and all of the resources that I've included. So I wanted to start out by just sort of thinking about the current scholarly research and publishing landscape in general, to give a little context for where we find ourselves. Um, we know there's this sort of publish or perish philosophy that dominates in a lot of discussions, puts heavy pressure on researchers to be producing and publishing output at a certain rate. We know we have problems with paper mills that will just sort of churn out papers, sell papers to authors. And we know we have a problem with predatory publishers and journals taking advantage of researchers who are feeling such high pressure and desperation to publish. We also know that we're seeing higher than usual numbers or higher than historical numbers of flawed or retracted studies, including several publishers, in particular in the last year or so, that have had thousands of their papers retracted. And there are some people who say that science is in the midst of a reproducibility crisis. So this is all the sort of chaos that we already find ourselves dealing with when generative AI enters the landscape, and we're having to think about how it is or may be used in scholarly research and publishing. We know some people are using it for lots of different things, but we find that we lack shared standards for how to transparently and reproducibly use it, and then how to document that use transparently. And so the question we find ourselves asking is really, how are these tools likely to impact research quality and integrity for better or for worse? And so that's my starting point here. And I want to think through various stages of the research and publishing process to think about some of the pros and cons, reliability, and ethics kinds of conversations here. So thinking sort of sequentially through our research process, I'm going to start from the stage of research question development. I think there are some possible benefits here to the use of generative AI. We can use these chatbots as general brainstorming partners. It's an opportunity to discuss ideas back and forth with a sounding board, sort of a thought partner who has no negative judgment and will never be too busy to talk to us. It may be able to help us narrow or broaden a topic that we're starting from as we're trying to kind of shape exactly the trajectory of our research. And it may be able to help us refine and clarify the precise research question that we want to address. But I think there's also some possible cons to using generative AI for this process. In particular, the potential impact of biases in these AI systems. We know that all of the training data fed into generative AI models is content created by humans. And humans inherently have our own biases, right? Our own conscious, subconscious, positive, negative. We're all full of certain biases. And so all of that bias comes through into the training model. There's no way to separate human bias out of that training model. And some models, depending on what kinds of content they've ingested and what kind of biases may be more prevalent, they may actually work to amplify those biases. So we want to be thinking about, in what way could those biases be unconsciously skewing the research questions that we come up with in ways we may not realize? We want to ask ourselves whether we're engaging in the critical thinking about our discipline. So, if I'm just using AI as a thought partner to help strengthen my own ideas, that's one thing. But if I'm asking AI to be the one who tells me, hey, give me a research question, then I'm not going to be engaged as much in thinking about my discipline and about where the critical gaps are in the literature. That's something that I'm not going to be able to develop those muscles if I'm really just asking AI to feed that to me. Um, and then I think ultimately this is my biggest concern is that the default behavior of a generative AI model is to compress meaning toward what is most familiar, recognizable, or easy to regenerate. So if we think about the way that AI models are working when they're creating output, the way that they're working through probability and prediction about, what words and ideas go together, what words should come next in this idea. Um, the kinds of ideas and expressions that they see the most frequently in their training data set are inherently going to be those that are most statistically likely for them to regenerate, right? They see one particular sentence and it's like, oh, I have seen that sentence 30,000 times. That must be the way that is most plausible to say this. But we need to ask ourselves whether that's really what we want when we're talking about developing research questions. Do we really want those to be gravitating towards things that are very familiar and recognizable? Or at what point do we kind of hit a wall where that's going to inhibit us from developing more novel and innovative kinds of research questions? So I'd love to see if you have any reflections that you'd like to share in the chat on this question. What other pros and cons do you see with using generative AI for developing research questions? I'm pausing a moment in case anyone would like to type anything in the chat. But if you don't have any opinions on it right now, that's okay too. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward here to the next stage of literature searching. And I think the key that's most important when we talk about literature searching is to say that if we do literature searching with generative AI, we want to be sure we're choosing purpose-built tools. What I mean by that is we have these generic chatbots, ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, etc., that are trained on just about anything and everything that the AI developers can get their hands on. These are often um, they often produce issues with their citations. If you're asking them to find literature, they may give you some real literature, but they are also highly likely to hallucinate non-existent literature. Now, this was a very big problem several years ago when ChatGPT first emerged. The problem has improved to some extent, and I will always say that some tools are better than others. There's a lot of variation between them. But this problem has not been eliminated. So even just as recently as within the past week, as I'm testing and experimenting and trying to kind of find the fail points of these tools, they will still generate completely non-existent sources, which is very counterproductive for our literature searching. So when we think about purpose-built tools, I'm referring to tools more like Cite, Elicit, Undermined, or Consensus. They're not the only ones. Those are just four popular examples. These tools are trained only on scholarly literature instead of all the other stuff that might have been scraped off the internet. When you put in a prompt or a question, they're going to first do a search in their scholarly literature database and then generate an answer based on what they find in those sources. This means they are far less prone to hallucination. They're going to give you citations for the sources that they actually reference in their data set. So if you're going to do literature searching with AI, use one of those tools that's designed for that purpose. We may need to manage our expectations regarding the quantity of scholarly literature that's going to be available through these kinds of tools. Now, this is changing all the time. More and more publishers are signing licensing agreements with one or more AI developers to allow their journal content to be available to different training models. So I'm sure we will start to see the corpus grow somewhat. But at least right now, if we think about some of these tools that can access whatever is online openly, and then whatever they may have licensed with particular publishers, the quantity of articles they have to search is still probably not going to compare to the number of articles you would search through something like the discovery service of an academic library. And so, therefore, I think probably the safest conclusion here is that we could consider generative AI as one part of a robust literature searching strategy, while recognizing that it is not a substitute for all of the other parts of a robust strategy, like searching traditional databases. Ah, okay. Let's see. I see in the chat. I like SciSpace for finding literature. Yeah, that's another one. There's so many of them that are purpose built for the literature searching. So the next stage I wanted to think about here is literature summary and synthesis, because this is one of the things I think that we hear a lot that AI is good at, right? I can feed it one article or a set of articles and say, hey, summarize this, or tell me the key takeaways from this. What are the common themes that connect these articles? And so it seems like this could be very helpful for kind of condensing our understanding of the literature when we're writing a review. Um, and I do think there is a lot of potential there. I think the only kind of caution we do need to be aware of, recent tests of AI to summarize scientific research in particular found that it tends to ignore uncertainty and nuance. As a result, it has a tendency to oversimplify or exaggerate the findings of the research. Now, obviously, I'm going to note that that's not a new problem, right? I think science and scholarly research, we've had problems for a long time that we may say something more nuanced in a paper, like we found a correlation here and we need to do more research to find out if one of these things causes the other. But then when that science gets picked up by more traditional media, gets written into a blurb in a magazine or shared on a blurb in the news or something, we tend to see that same kind of oversimplification, right? So I don't think this is a new problem, but it is something we need to be aware of that still happens with generative AI also. The risks, if it oversimplifies and exaggerates, is that it could mislead the users who are reading that output and potentially amplify misinformation. Now, you're going to hear me say this pretty repeatedly, but some systems will likely do better than others. There's a lot of variation in capability. In particular, I do want to note that a lot of paid systems, when you're at a paid subscription tier, they will perform with better quality than the free tier. I find that a little bit problematic in terms of equitable access to the technology, but that's the world we find ourselves in at the moment, is that you're probably going to get better results with those paid models. Similarly, there's certain tools like NotebookLM that's designed to reference only your sources, no other training data like ChatGPT. And you may find that you have better results with things like that if you're asking it to specifically summarize or synthesize one or several documents. All right, now I'm going to think about the data analysis and visualization stage. Some journals do permit the use of generative AI as long as it is detailed in the methods, same as you would detail any other data analysis methods that you might have used. However, there is a caveat that some journals explicitly prohibit AI-generated images and figures. So even if you have used generative AI to help you do some form of analysis, you've transparently disclosed that in your methods, you still may need to manually create any related charts or graphs if they do not accept AI-generated versions. I think the bottom line, what we need to ask ourselves when we think about whether to use generative AI at this stage is, will that use be transparent and reproducible? That's kind of the core that we're looking for in scientific methods, right? Clear, transparent, something that some other researcher could come along and follow step by step to the letter, reproduce our experiment, and see if they reproduce our findings. The problem with generative AI, it's often referred to as being a black box. We put a prompt in, there's output that comes out. But what happens in the middle in that black box is not really clear. Even people who program and work with generative AI, they can't spell out for you bullet by bullet exactly what the model did to make certain choices and to follow certain paths and to come up with this result. So it's kind of this mushy question mark in the middle. And that doesn't align very well with the value of transparency. And I think that's sort of borne out by this recent survey finding that 84% of researchers have used generative AI, but only 22% trust it. Because I think we're left asking, how can I fully trust the result of something if I don't fully understand what it's doing and how it's getting there? We also want to ask ourselves, if we use this method with our data, will our field accept it? Will our peers accept it? Now, different disciplines are at very different points right now in terms of AI adoption or AI comfort levels. So I need to know my field, which may be very different than your field. If I go out and conduct this study and I use, what I think are these really innovative methods leveraging all the strengths of generative AI, and then I still have to send that paper to peer review. Are my peer reviewers likely to look at that and find that something acceptable within our field? Or is there a good likelihood that my peer reviewers are going to push back with skepticism and suspicion and say, these are not transparent, validated methods, and we don't think this has a place in our publications? We don't really want to waste that time and momentum doing those methods if that's not going to be acceptable in our field at this time. So that's going to be a question for each of us to ask ourselves in making our research decisions. Still thinking about data analysis and visualization here, I wanted to share a few more thoughts about quantitative versus qualitative operations. So on the quantitative side, it's been suggested that generative AI could be beneficial in terms of data validation, error detection, and trend forecasting. But on the offside of that, on the kind of con side, we need to realize that it can struggle with complex reasoning and is technically somewhat bad at math. And the reason that people say it's bad at math is because LLMs aren't really using a math apparatus to do math. If I prompt my LLM and say, what is 2 plus 2? It's not like opening a calculator and actually doing a 2 plus 2 operation that is always going to come back with this, consistent, factual, equated answer. It's actually still referencing its data set to complete the sentence. Now, looking at everything in its data set, anywhere that it sees 2 plus 2 equals, it's most likely going to see 4 as the next word in that sentence, right? That's the most statistically likely way to end that equation. So it may be able to tell me that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But as I get into much more complex kinds of operations, if it doesn't have the data there to see that same kind of equation, it's not necessarily going to be able to do that complicated mathematical operation itself. One big caution that we want to think about using generative AI to do our quantitative data analysis for us is that if we don't know the methods well enough that we're having it use, we're not going to be able to judge the output, right? If I have it do some complex statistical thing for me, and the reason that I'm giving it to generative AI is because I don't really understand it, well, then I'm not going to know if it does it right. I'm not going to be able to see the kind of clear red flags that an expert in that method would recognize. So it tends to be very important that we still know enough about what we're asking it to do for us. And I really like this quote from Schwartz that generative AI can facilitate data analysis, but human oversight and good statistical knowledge still remain critical. It can be an assistant without being a substitute to our own understanding. Now, sort of on the qualitative side of things, some of the strengths that have been suggested of generative AI is providing task-specific help like text triage and improving clarity and scalability, especially in data-heavy projects. But one of the downsides that's been noted is that qualitative research is inherently human-centered. And so when you bring in AI as an analyst, it really sort of undermines the entire goal of centering and focusing on the human experience and the human interpretation of that experience. So the concern is that ultimately a non-human analysis of qualitative data might be uninterpretable. It might simply not make sense. And so the caution here is that it's critical to distinguish correctly between AI assisted processing and true interpretive analysis, and that we understand where that separation is of where to involve generative AI in that processing and where to maintain human control over that actual interpretation. And then ultimately, kind of across quant and qual, really any methods we're doing, we want to be cautious and remember that AI is highly limited in ethical decision making and scientific judgments. It's not a human. It doesn't have ethics. So anywhere that our research and our work gets into these areas of decision making, judgment, ethics, these kinds of things, this is the area where the human needs to be driving the bus as opposed to the AI model. Okay, so let's think about actual writing, the actual writing stage of our writing. Um, it is usually viewed as being acceptable to use generative AI for checking our writing, right? Running it through, looking at grammar and punctuation, our language usage, our flow, stuff like that. This is similar enough to what we've done in word processing programs for so many years that this generally doesn't raise a lot of concern, I think. The only caveat here is just to be aware that you don't let AI, smooth out your writing to the extent that it erases your authentic voice as a researcher. But then there's definitely going to be a red line there between it checking your writing and it being the writer. Most journals are not going to acknowledge AI as a co-author. I can't say this paper was authored by Aaron Owens and ChatGPT because it's not a human, and it can't be held accountable as an author. So my name is going on it, no matter how much of it ChatGPT might have written. I'm going to come back to bias again. You'll hear me mention bias multiple times in this presentation, but we want to beware of the potential impact of AI bias on the writing in our papers. And this was sort of an interesting perspective I found, saying that normally we talk about keeping a human in the loop, making sure that the human evaluates the AI output and addresses it accordingly. But there's this suggestion that if the model's bias is the same as the reader's bias, they may not actually be able to recognize that bias in the output. And the example that was given here from this source was a white male researcher evaluating output from an LLM that is trained on mostly white male based data. So it's like the same perspective looking at something. They may not really be able to turn around and see where there's a gap or an issue. So that's kind of an interesting consideration that we want to say, watch out for bias, but we also have to acknowledge that there's going to be moments where, depending on what that bias is, you may not see it from your lens. I definitely think it's worth asking ourselves, how much writing can I outsource to generative AI before I'm sort of sacrificing my own opportunity to flex and strengthen my cognitive skills in writing? So if I'm not practicing academic writing, if I'm asking generative AI to do it because I don't feel like I'm good enough at it, well, how am I going to get better? By not practicing. And sort of said this above, but over reliance, if we over rely on generative AI for writing, we really risk the loss of our unique style and our original expression. We kind of end up at a place where all of the articles sound the same, which I'm not sure is really what any of us are aiming for, right? So then ultimately our question is, can you automate your responsibility as an author? Now I like this infographic. This is from a poll or a survey that the journal Nature did. They asked the respondents to consider a scenario of a researcher using AI to write different sections of a research paper and asked them whether they would find that to be always appropriate, only appropriate if disclosed, or never appropriate. And as you can see by the red lines, by the red bars here, the sections where people are least comfortable with AI writing is the results in the discussion sections. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? Those are really the areas where our expertise, our judgment, and our interpretation need to come into play, as opposed to some of these other sections like abstract and introduction. There tends to be a little bit more leniency from respondents about AI use, although you'll notice that even then, the gray bars are significantly larger than the blue bars, indicating that most researchers still feel like this is only appropriate if we disclose the fact that we used AI. And we will definitely be talking about disclosure in a few minutes. I thought this was a really interesting quote, just bringing home that scientific writing isn't the packaging around knowledge, but one of the key places of knowledge production. And crafting a story around our data is as much a part of science as the experiments themselves. I thought this really, really kind of summed up how I felt about the idea of letting generative AI write about my research for me. All right, so we'll think a little bit about the proofreading stage. Um, I think in general, proofreading is one of these areas where it seems like, yeah, generative AI could be a very useful tool, kind of speed up proofreading and correction. Interestingly, a new study found LLMs make significantly more edits and revisions than human editors. Sounds pretty good so far, getting more edits. Those edits tend to be less substantive, so they might be correcting very minor grammatical structures in a sentence, but they're not necessarily strengthening the scientific arguments. Maybe that's okay, right? We're still getting kind of a really quick copy edit done. The only problem is that this study also found that LLMs have a higher error rate. So I think this kind of gives us a good perspective that this still may be a great tool to help us start the proofreading process and get a lot of edits back in a short amount of time, recognizing that then a human editor still probably needs to evaluate all of that output and decide which of the edits proposed by the AI are actually worthwhile, which ones actually add value, and which ones are erroneous or not valuable. All right, I wanted to touch on a couple of copyright considerations when we think about using generative AI in research. The first one is to recognize that it is possible for generative AI to create output that infringes on existing intellectual property or copyright. And so this is sort of a visual example. On the right-hand side, you see some pictures of the Yoda character from the Star Wars films, and these are actually the copyrighted images from the films. On the left-hand side is an image that was output by Midjourney, which is an AI image generating tool. And the character in the Midjourney image is very recognizably similar to the Yoda character. Any average person who had seen the Star Wars films and saw this image would likely recognize this as being similar to Yoda, would recognize that he's holding something similar to a lightsaber. And therefore, even though it was created by AI and someone was not necessarily intending to infringe, if they used this image somewhere, they could still face legal repercussions from the copyright holder. But this isn't only an image issue. Another recent study found that Claude could generate entire books near verbatim at 95.8% accuracy. Now, this is mostly books that I'm sure this is mostly books that were fed into its training model multiple times, right? And it's a lot of it is books like Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, like kind of popular things that would have been multiple places in the training data. But that does indicate to us that there is also a textual risk there of outputting text that may not be entirely original. So there's one side of this of thinking about the output we get from generative AI and how we use it and whether it might infringe copyright. There's also the side we want to think about, though, if we are training our own AI as part of a research project. We want to think carefully about whether we use copyrighted material to train it, what we're using, and how we use it because of these potentials for it to come out in unintended ways. We need to realize that content which was created solely by AI, so for example, an AI generated image, if I just put in a prompt and copy the image, that's not copyrightable. Even though I put in the prompt, I didn't make the image. I'm not a human author. Therefore, there's no one to hold human copyright in that work. Um, so this is important, I think, as researchers, because if we think in terms of getting to a point where we sign a copyright transfer or we're monetizing the output of our work, we have to ensure that any AI generated components are clearly marked to recognize that any copyright in the overall work does not extend to those components that were not human authored. All right, so sort of the last stage of the process here that I wanted to look at is editor and peer reviews of submissions to journals. So we know that some journals are already using AI for various things. The editor may be submitting it to like an AI detection kind of tool, which, they've done plagiarism checks for a long time. Now they're sort of trying to extend that to AI checks. Whether those tools are very accurate or not is a problem. Some journals are feeding the submissions into an algorithm that attempts to predict how likely that article is to have impact in the future, how high impact the paper will be, so that they can decide if it's worth reviewing or publishing. And we certainly know that we also have some issues with peer reviewers who accept a peer review and then go upload the manuscript into ChatGPT and get it to help them write reviewer comments. So I kind of wanted to think about some different angles on this. It's been suggested that there could be some benefits to editorial use of AI in terms of assisting with translation, checking references, and providing more thorough feedback. But on the other hand, I'm going to say bias again. It can perpetuate bias. If we think about an algorithm attempting to predict the impact of a paper, well, considering the fact that the historical record of what has been published and impactful is going to be skewed towards certain types of voices, certain types of researchers who have had more advantaged access to publishing mechanisms. There's going to be marginalized voices that are not as well represented in the historical record of what's been published. So is the algorithm really detecting what's going to have impact, or is it just perpetuating what's been historically skewed to begin with? Is it going to find that, oh, white males from prestigious institutions have more impact just because historically they always have? That's an inherent bias in trying to use that data for decision making. We also want to really keep in mind here the caution that uploading someone's unpublished manuscript to an external system could represent intellectual property or privacy violations. Now, I say it could because that does depend on a lot of factors. If you submit a manuscript to a journal and you have to give consent to something specific saying that they're going to upload it to a certain system, then it might not violate anything because you've given consent. But if editors are doing that without your knowledge, particularly if they're uploading it to a system that then keeps that data in its training model, or if a peer reviewer is doing this without anyone's knowledge, that really could represent an intellectual property and privacy violation that I think is deeply problematic. Bottom line here, an AI tool is not the researcher's peer. So I do think we need to think carefully about our responsibility to our peers in the research community and not outsourcing that to an AI tool. But at the same time, speaking with my own editor hat on, we acknowledge that there is a shortage in most disciplines. There's a shortage of quality reviewers to read a growing quantity of submissions. So I think we can appreciate where the pain point is that is encouraging people to think about generative AI as a tool for greater speed and efficiency. I think we can acknowledge where that's coming from while also still not necessarily feeling comfortable about it. And I'd love if you have any thoughts to share in the chat. I'd love for any of your additional opinions about generative AI use by editors and peer reviewers. Right. I want to make a quick comment here on the idea of training future researchers. Um, there's a lot of steps in our research process that we could maybe automate with generative AI, but maybe those are steps that also could help to train and acculturate future researchers. So, for example, we know undergraduate research has been identified as a high impact practice. Um, uh, Participating in research as an undergraduate student is something that has a significant impact on their academic achievement and success moving forward. Similarly, if reviews start being done by AI, early career researchers lose that opportunity to learn how to do good reviewing, even though that's a skill which would also help them to evaluate and improve their own manuscripts. So, kind of like, what are we sacrificing when we gain that speed and efficiency? So, I had a little bit of an activity here. Going to encourage everyone to take a moment and look up the website of a journal, somewhere you have published, you want to publish, a journal you read a lot, anything of that sort, and see if you can identify policies on their website, either from the individual journal or from their larger publisher, that relate to the use of generative AI. And if you're drawing a blank and can't think of a journal title, I've suggested one from my own discipline on that you could borrow. But I'm going to give everybody just a moment and feel free to comment in the chat or unmute and share if you find something interesting from your journal or fail to find any policies from them.
Sage has a whole page and um, categories and like more information than hopefully you would ever need.
Good. Okay. So Sage has some really robust details. All right. All right. Well, I captured a few examples here in the slides, just to sort of give you a taste of some of what's out there and some of the variety. The journal Science says that text generated by AI cannot be used, nor figures, images, or graphics. So they're just going to keep it simple and say, we don't want anything that AI made. Elsevier, a little looser, says authors should disclose any use of AI and a statement will appear in the published work. Now, journals from the American Psychological Association go one step further. They say the use must be disclosed in the methods section, cited using this special template they provide, and the author is required to upload the full output of the AI as supplemental material. Wiley goes even a little bit further. They want you to maintain all of that documentation of what you used, its purpose, etc. They also want you to maintain documentation on how you personally reviewed and verified all the AI generated content. So there's kind of a big spectrum here of whether you cannot use it at all or whether you can, but then to what extent you're going to need to document and back up that use. I've got another link on the slide if you just feel like exploring it later that's got more example publisher statements, kind of a cross-sectional audit there. But I think it's really telling to go and look at journals in your own discipline and kind of get a sense of whether most of them do or do not have policies up yet and kind of what those policies look like discipline-wide. So when we're thinking about the publisher policies on generative AI, I think the most important thing is to choose a journal to target early in your project. This was already a best practice anyway, but generative AI really, really just makes it even more important. I don't want to get to a point where I've already done my whole project, written my whole article, I've put in all the work, then I go look at a journal and discover that they're going to want me to submit all of this supporting documentation that I have not maintained and that I don't know how to go back and get retroactively because I wasn't prepared for that requirement. So the sooner I know what journal I want to target, the more diligent I can be in my processes about keeping all of the documentation that I might need and being prepared to fulfill their requirements. As we're choosing a journal, we want to be sure we read their AI policies carefully. Partly that's what am I allowed to do with AI? But I think equally important is finding out in their policies, what are they allowed to do with AI? Are they allowed to submit your paper to one of these algorithms that's going to predict its impactfulness? Are they allowed to license your published work to AI developers, which effectively allows them to profit off your writing a second time? You may have to contact the editor if there's things you want to know about that they don't make clear in their policies. But then ultimately, you need to assess all of that information according to your preferences and values. So deciding what are you comfortable with and then balancing that against what they allow and deciding, okay, I'm not comfortable with everything that they're allowed to do with my work. I'm going to go find another journal. Or saying, hey, I'm comfortable with these policies. I'm going to go ahead and continue working towards submission at this journal. But that way we're able to proceed with our project and our write-up in an informed way. Ultimately, if we use it, verify it, document it, save records of all your prompts and responses, verify any facts or analysis that the AI generates. Be sure once you get to interpretation and decision kinds of stages that those are all human driven, because ultimately you as the only author listed in the byline, not ChatGPT, you bear accountability for anything included in your paper and any harm that an error might cause. Um, Ultimately, if I publish a medical paper that includes an error and a patient dies, I'm not going to be able to make the excuse that it's not my fault because ChatGPT made the error. I'm still going to be the one that's liable for allowing that error um, to get through. Okay, so let's wrap up here talking about disclosure. We can see from looking at the policies that most publishers currently accept that if you can use AI at all, you need to be disclosing it. Part of the problem is that their policies for what and how to disclose vary wildly. But the other interesting thing I think here is the goal of the disclosure generally seems to be increasing transparency and thus increasing credibility and trust. That makes sense. That's how we approach most things in scientific processes, right? We assume that the more transparent we are about all of our methods, all of our analysis, how we came to all of these conclusions, we assume that makes our work more credible and trustworthy, and it does. But with generative AI in particular, this gets a little bit turned on its head. We are disclosing it to help people trust us more. And yet, a study done in late 25 suggested that the disclosure of AI use in scholarly work could actually erode the reader's trust in the author. So just seeing a note that said that this author used generative AI for anything made the reader less trustful. So I think this really creates a very complicated paradox. We want the transparency of the disclosure, but we don't want that unexpected backlash of negative reaction from the reader. And sort of, where does that leave us? How do we balance that? I think ultimately where we are right now, we're going to have to follow the requirements of the journal that we're publishing in. But I think it's also important that all of us as researchers are having these conversations within our own disciplines and advocating for the norms that we want to see, really pressing to say our discipline should agree that we're going to disclose these things, we're not going to disclose these, we're going to do it like this, like creating a norm that then at least other readers in your discipline who are already existing in that same norm are less likely to then find it to be to create a trust issue. So this is one approach that we see for a lot of disclosure, effectively just explaining what tool you used, why you used AI, and then some details on how you've used it. And this is sort of an example of what that could look like in a statement. This acknowledges the use of Claude to improve organization and academic tone It includes the exact prompts that that the author used, and then he explains how he used it to identify areas that could be strengthened, and then go to those areas and make original edits. There's also this alternative approach to disclosure. It's been proposed by Avi Stayman. He's kind of a big name in the scholarly publishing world. He's a frequent contributor to the Scholarly Kitchen blog, which is amazing if you're into nerdy scholarly publishing insight. He basically proposes that different uses warrant different levels of disclosure. And so, very low risk use of AI probably doesn't need to be disclosed, whereas high risk use needs to be disclosed fully and transparently. And to define high risk use, he focuses on AI use that could affect methods validity, obscure data provenance, or compromise replication. And so this quote from him, he literally says, like, we don't need to just track the use more aggressively. We need to double down on the actual foundations of scholarly trust that AI can't replace and make sure that we're thinking about and explaining how we've mitigated any risks for AI to affect the research integrity. So again, I'd kind of love any comments or responses you might have. Welcome to type in the chat or unmute. If you have any thoughts about pros and cons of disclosing the use of generative AI and whether you would feel differently about disclosing certain kinds of use compared to others. The Elizabeth says, I think the high versus low risk makes sense and gives words to thoughts I've had about it. Yep. Yeah, I really like that high and low risk. And I know there's several efforts underway to sort of categorize types of AI use in research and publishing, so that it would be more straightforward for an author to kind of look at this chart and say, okay, I used it in ways A, B, C, and A doesn't need to be disclosed, but B and C do. Um, Kind of help make it easier to decide where that risk is, where the value is for disclosure, but also provide common language where we could all refer to the same labels for different types of use. Um, Now, right now there's a couple of different ones underway, so they may not agree with each other on exactly what that language looks like, but this is definitely something I think we're going to see continuing to develop. So kind of closing thoughts here, any use of AI in scholarly research should at a minimum reflect the core principles of human vetting, substantial human contribution, and then acknowledgement and transparency. And I think really it comes down to each of us asking ourselves, what kind of research ecosystem do we want to be a part of? I can picture this extreme in the future of a computer writes my paper, which is then reviewed and published by another computer, and then waits to be read and synthesized by yet another computer when someone feeds it into a literature synthesis tool. And I don't know that extreme where it doesn't even feel like humans are really reading, writing, and engaging in this together. Like, I don't think that's the kind of research ecosystem I want. So I think it's helpful for each of us to think about what that looks like and think about what different kinds of use might be contributing to in terms of creating norms or shortcuts. Kind of close with this quote from Marina Kisley, because I love this quote that she's talking specifically about letting AI write research papers and says that collectively we seem to have bypassed the should and moved quickly onto the how, but really our long-term objectives do matter. So just the last few slides here, I've included a couple of other activities that you might find interesting to go and engage with generative AI doing some of these processes and get a better sense for yourself of how well you think it does. And then at the very end, I've got a few slides here of links and resources that you can refer back to after the session. And so the link on the screen is where you can download the slides, and I am putting that in the chat as well. So if you're interested in referring back to any of this, please feel free to download that slideshow. And other than that, I'm going to open up the floor now and ask you what questions you have for me. And you're welcome to unmute and talk or use the chat, whatever you're comfortable with if you've got questions. Okay. Doesn't look like there's any questions coming in. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to join me today. And if you have anything you'd like to discuss on this topic in the future, please feel free to reach out. I hope you have a great rest of your day and enjoy the rest of AI week.